Well, tonight we're going to cover chess tactics, the bishop and queen attacking the king rook 6, king rook 7 squares. It's a continuation of last week's class. We only got through half of the examples. So this is our first position. It's quite apparent that white is going to be doing the attacking in as much as black's bishop is shed in behind the pawns. Looks like it was a French defense. Now white's bishop isn't ready to do the attack. It's only on f1. And the white knight on f3 is ready to move up to g5 to join the attack. And the queen can go maybe to c2 or go on up to h5 to help out. So let's see what the first move is. Okay, so the bishop comes out. It's now aiming toward the king side and threatens to win a pawn by bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and rook takes pawn on d5. So let's see what black does. Black retreats the knight. That might be a bad idea. Generally, when you're in a defensive position, you shouldn't retreat your forces unless you're forced to. So let's go back. The other drawback in black's position is obviously his queen knight on c6 is pinned by the rook. So that brings to mind moving the queen out of the way somewhere to break the pin. Now we might lose the d5 pawn. Like I said, bishop takes knight, pawn takes. But let's say our queen had moved to b6. We could move the white squared bishop and attack the rook on d5 and get some counterplay for our pawn along that open diagonal. So anyway, I think knight to e7 is not the best move. Oh, white goes ahead and sacrifices right away. Now we have the queen and knight coming in to attack. So obviously the king can't retreat to g8 because there's no answer to queen to h5, threatening checkmate. There's no knight that can cover the h7 square, and there's not time to move any of the pawns up, so the king has to advance to g6. Now typically with this, the attacking move for white is to bring the queen behind the knight to get a discovered check on the king, which, by the way, might win the black queen. Knight takes king pawn check. Knight takes queen. Now, our queen would be hanging to the black bishop, but after we take the queen, we can snap off the rook on a8 and probably have more than enough compensation. We'd get 2 pawns and a rook for the 2 pieces. So let's see. So white does bring the queen up. Now we know what the threat is. White's threatening more or less knight takes e6 check, but there's also the possible threat of pawn on h2 can join the attack with h2 to h4, which would threaten h5 check. And that would also allow the rook to come into the attack through rook to h3 and rook to g3. So let's see what black tries to do. Okay, this is the typical defense for black in this scenario where the queen threatens a discovered attack. You attack the queen. Now, to keep the attack going, white has a choice. He could retreat queen to g3, which would re-threaten a discovered check. And he would also have to weigh pawn takes pawn en passant on f6 as to which would give the stronger attack. Now, if pawn takes pawn, black would like to take with the king to get out of that discovered check. rook takes wouldn't get out of the discovered check. So let's say king takes. Now, white could go knight to h7, forking the rook and king, driving the king back to f7, and we could take the rook, and we would get compensation for our two pieces. So we'd have a pawn and a rook, 6 points, and he would have two pieces. So that would probably justify our sacrifice. But let's see what white comes up with. I don't remember. Okay, rather than pawn takes pawn en passant, even though white would win the rook and the pawn for the two pieces, white chose to bring the queen back to continue attacking because white felt that after he would take the rook and without the minor pieces and he wouldn't have the queen threat anymore, that black would have an equal game and white's attack would fizzle out. So that's why white chose to retreat the queen, renewing the threat of knight takes e6, and it's the bigger threat now because it would win the queen outright. So black has to move the queen. Notice he can't move the king back. He could move it to the side of the board with king to h6. That probably wouldn't help black because white could protect the knight, say with bishop back to c1, and that would threaten discovered check with the king at h6, wouldn't it? Knight takes pawn. And on top of that, white would also threaten queen to h4 check. The king goes back to g6. The answer would be queen to h7 checkmate. So moving the king to h6 isn't really an option either. So he moves the queen so it's out of the way of the knight. So he drops it back to c8. He knows he has to he wants to stay on the bishop. He wants to protect that e6 square, reinforce the protection. That's why he chose c8. And he wanted to get away from the knight. If he went to d8, the knight could still hit him. And going to b8 wouldn't make any sense because the queen can't do anything from b8. At least at c8, it protects the bishop. All right, let's see what white is going to do. I have a suspicion it's h4. Let's see. Nope. Okay. Now he drops his rook back. That's interesting. He's going to redeploy his rook along the third rank. Maybe he's going to move his queen maybe to f4 and then bring the rook to g3 and have a discovered check with the rook. Also interesting, again, the black knight's pinned against the queen, so the black knight can't take that d4 pawn, which is no longer protected by the bishop because the rook blocks the bishop. Anyway, black's problem is even though he's a piece up, he doesn't have any good squares for his pieces, and white can always win a pawn and the rook with knight takes pawn on e6 followed by knight takes rook. Let's see what, okay, he tries f4. He's going to try to drive the queen away, and he opens up a nice square for his knight. If he gets the chance, he can drop that knight from e7 to f5, and maybe that would help defend the king. So the queen just goes up, renewing the discovered check, but notice that now the white rook can come to h3, and then the threat would be queen to h5 check, and the king would have to go up to f5, and we would have a discovered check, and it would soon be checkmate. So let's see what black comes up with. Black drops his knight in to f5, and white swings his rook over to h3, threatening the queen h5 check. So Now it looks like black's going to have to swing his rook from f8 to h8 to guard the queen to h5 threat and check. Now, that's going to pose the other problems. If he does that, it looks like white can do something like knight takes e6 pawn, discovered check. Notice that the white knight in the white queen, well, they're attacking the g7 pawn, but it is protected by the knight on f5. So I'm not sure. Let's see what happens. So the rook does come over. That prevents queen h5 check. Now our problem is, what is the correct attacking maneuver for white here? I think we're at a critical point where white may have a win. Who sees the win? Let's see. Nope. So much for that. Knight to e6, king to f7. Oh, look, we forgot that after taking the pawn on e6, the knight's unprotected. So queen takes knight, and this is an obvious win. King over here. Now he's threatening to take our knight. Of course, we have a nice check on g5 if we need it. So let's say we do queen to g5 check. What would black do? King takes knight. Then what do we do as white after king takes knight?
Check him.
On g6, right? That forces him back to e7, doesn't it? Then we got queen takes g7 pawn check, and now we're on the rook with the queen, and he can't let's see. And he can't move the king up. When we check him on g7, he can't go to d6 because our pawn covers that square. That means he's forced to the first row, and we would have rook takes rook check, winning the queen. So I think we just solved it. Yep. Yep, there we go. Nice win, very good. Let's go on to our next example. This is easy. Black is threatening queen takes rook pawn check, followed by queen to a1 checkmate. So whatever we do, it has to be fast. White to play and win. What's the winning move for white?
Queen takes h7.
Right. And our bishop covers the two escape squares, setting up the checkmate which follows. Rook over checkmate. That's pretty. And of course, we knew it had to be checkmate because black was threatening to checkmate us in turn, so it had to all be forced checks. Okay, this is kind of like the last one. The black king's in the corner. The white bishop on b3 keeps the king in the corner. We have a knight on h5 with, at some point, knight to g6 check. We have a rook on f3 waiting to finish off the attack. So this is pretty easy. What's the winning move for white?
Knight to g6 check.
Right. Knight to g6, pawn takes, rook to f3, threatening rook over mate, and pawn up doesn't work, and the king move doesn't work, so there's no answer for black. That's a nice checkmate there. Okay. On the other hand, white has some attacking chances himself. He has the queen on c2 attacking h7. His knight is hovering around the black king, and his rook is conveniently placed on f3 where it can go to h3 and attack with the with the queen. So it must be white to play and win.
Yeah, I got it.
You got it? What is it?
Queen takes h7 check.
Okay. King takes. Rook over. King back. Now the pawn's pinned.
Knight g6.
And they can't stop Rook to h8. Very good. No, that's pretty. This is even easier. Mike, would you care to do the honors since you're solving all these for us?
Let me think about it real quick.
Okay.
All right. Knight to e7 check.
King over.
Queen takes pawn check.
King up.
Rook h1.
Checkmate. Very good. I think we're getting that pattern down. I can't wait to play it in my next game. The black queen is pinned to the king. That looks desperate. But black wins just like the last checkmate. So black to play and win. I'm not even going to ask Mike to bother telling us what it is. Knight e2 check. Rook takes pawn check. And rook over. Oh, the queen comes in. And then we have the checkmate. Okay. Well, after 4 or 5 in a row, it does help. Maybe the next one will be more complicated.
White to play?
White to play and win. I'm open to suggestions. Okay, well, let's see what the author has to say. F5. Oh, pawn takes. Well, this is easy now.
Right.
But we'll run through this and then we'll go back. So now it works like a champ. There's our checkmate. All right, let's see. Well, white obviously is the attacker. White has 3 minor pieces out. Black only has 2. White has a nice center pawn shoved up on black, so black can't get his white squared bishop developed. And black's king's in the center. Sometimes the author, we have to develop these things a little bit though, so let's see what happens. Okay, the knight comes in. So the answer is going to be castle. And this is easy now. We play queen up, pawn up. Now the F pawn's pinned, so the knight's not really protected. Queen takes knight, pawn takes, bishop takes, queen over. Oh, and then just drop the bishop in because both the kingside pawns are pinned. That's kind of pretty. And there's no way to stop the checkmate. Okay. See what our next one is. Okay, I just gave it away. Knight takes pawn. I guess queen over. Well, we're going to, obviously knight takes pawn check, wipes out black's kingside, and is a double check. So the king would have to move over. Oh, okay. So I propose knight takes h6 check. Anyone see a better move than that? All right. So the king has to go there. Now how does white finish black off? Who would suggest a move?
Well, yeah, knight f7 check.
Go back. Right.
Yeah, also take
And then the mate. Very good. Okay. Well, I have more time than examples, but very good. Thanks. That'll do it for tonight.